The first time the envelope arrived, I thought it was a mistake. It was a crisp white envelope with a logo from a hotel I didn't recognize, the Aspen Ridge Hotel, and my husband's name was printed in bold letters just above our home address. Inside was a neatly itemized receipt for a 3-night stay in a deluxe suite. My stomach twisted as I read through the charges: room service for 2, a bottle of champagne, spa treatments. It totaled over $1,200. I held the paper in my trembling hands, my breath quick and shallow. Rationalizations filled my head. A work trip? A surprise plan he hadn't mentioned? I wanted to believe there was an innocent explanation, but a faint whisper of doubt gnawed at the edge of my mind. I waited until Greg came home that evening, determined to ask him directly. He walked through the door like any other day, loosening his tie and kissing me absent-mindedly on the forehead before heading to the kitchen. "Greg," I started, my voice shaky. "Did you stay at the Aspen Ridge Hotel recently?" He froze mid-step, the fridge door still open. Slowly, he turned to face me, his brow furrowed. "Aspen Ridge? Never heard of it. Why?" I held up the envelope, the receipt peeking out. His face flickered with something, a flash of panic? Guilt, before he quickly masked it with a confused smile. "That's weird," he said, shrugging. "Must be some mistake. Probably a mix-up with another Greg Thompson. I'll call and straighten it out." I wanted to believe him. I desperately wanted to believe him. But something about the way his voice wavered, the way his eyes wouldn't quite meet mine, planted a seed of suspicion. I decided to let it go for the moment, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. A week later, another envelope arrived. This time, it was from a different hotel, the Lakeshore Inn. Same scenario: Greg's name, our address, a receipt for 2 nights in a luxury suite. Dinner for 2 at the hotel's restaurant. A bottle of wine. My chest tightened as I scanned the details. My mind spiraled with questions. Who was he sharing those meals with? Who was in that suite with him? When he got home that night, I didn't bother showing him the envelope. I could already anticipate his excuses. Instead, I took matters into my own hands. The next morning, after Greg left for work, I called the Lakeshore Inn directly. "Good morning," I said, my voice trembling. "I received a bill for a recent stay under my husband's name, Greg Thompson, but I'm not sure it's correct. Could you confirm the details for me?" The receptionist hesitated. "I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't share guest information without their permission." I felt my stomach sink. "I understand, but I'm his wife. There seems to be some sort of misunderstanding, and I just need to clarify it." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. "One moment, please," the woman said, her tone softening. I waited, the silence stretching painfully long. Finally, she returned. The reservation was for February 10th to February 12th. It was booked under Greg Thompson, and, she hesitated. A second guest was listed under the reservation. A Ms. Laura Mitchell. I nearly dropped the phone. My heart thundered in my chest. "Are you sure?" I managed to croak. "Yes, ma'am. It's in our system." I thanked her and hung up, my hands shaking so violently I could barely set the phone down. Laura Mitchell. The name meant nothing to me, but the implications were crystal clear. He wasn't on a work trip. He wasn't planning some surprise for me. He was with another woman. For hours, I sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at the bills spread out before me. The receipts, the charges, the dates, they painted a picture I didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. How long had this been going on? Who was Laura Mitchell to him? My mind churned, alternating between disbelief, rage, and a deep, aching sadness. That evening, I confronted him. When he walked through the door, I didn't bother with pleasantries. I tossed the envelopes onto the counter in front of him, my hands clenched into fists at my sides. "Who is Laura Mitchell?" I demanded, my voice shaking with barely contained fury. His face went pale. For a moment, he just stared at the envelopes, as if they might somehow disappear if he looked hard enough. Then he opened his mouth, but no sound came out. Finally, he stammered, I don't know what you're talking about. Don't lie to me, Greg. I shouted, tears streaming down my face. I called the hotel. They told me everything. How could you do this to me? To us? He sank into a chair, his head in his hands. It's not what you think, he mumbled. Not what I think. I snapped. So you didn't spend Valentine's weekend at the Lakeshore Inn with Laura Mitchell? You didn't order room service for two or a bottle of wine? He looked up at me, his eyes red-rimmed. I didn't mean for you to find out like this. I froze. His words were like a knife to my chest. So it's true, I whispered. You're cheating on me. It's complicated, he said, his voice barely audible. Complicated? I repeated, my voice rising again. You betrayed me, Greg. You lied to me, and now you're telling me it's complicated? The room fell silent except for my ragged breathing. Finally, he spoke, his voice hollow. It's not just an affair, Allison. There's more. More? My stomach churned with dread. What do you mean, more? He wouldn't look at me. Laura, she's pregnant. The world seemed to tilt around me. My knees buckled, and I collapsed into the nearest chair. Pregnant. The word echoed in my mind like a cruel taunt. I couldn't speak, couldn't think. The man I had built my life with, the man I thought I knew, was living a double life, and now, he was going to have a child with another woman. I don't remember much of what happened after that. There was yelling. Crying. Accusations hurled like daggers. He begged for forgiveness, swearing he still loved me, that he had made a terrible mistake. But his words felt empty, like echoes in a hollow room. That night, I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, replaying every moment of our marriage in my mind. Every memory now felt tainted, every promise broken. I didn't know what the future held, but one thing was certain, the man I thought I knew no longer existed. And neither did the life I thought we shared. The days that followed felt like a waking nightmare. I wandered through the house like a ghost, clutching the remnants of a life I could no longer recognize. The envelopes, the receipts, they sat in a neat pile on the kitchen counter, a cruel testament to Greg's betrayal. Every time I walked past them, my chest ached with a pain so raw it felt like my heart was being torn apart all over again. Greg tried to talk to me. He hovered around the house, his presence unbearable yet inescapable. He kept saying the same things over and over, how sorry he was, how he never wanted to hurt me, how he made a mistake. Each word was like poison, seeping into my veins, making me sicker with every syllable. You didn't just make a mistake, Greg, I snapped one night, my voice hoarse from days of crying. You made a choice. Over and over again. You chose her. You chose to lie to me. And now she's having your baby. He flinched as if I had slapped him. For a fleeting moment, I almost felt guilty. Almost. I couldn't stay in the house. Not with him there, not with the walls closing in on me. I packed a bag and left without saying a word. As I drove aimlessly through the city, I realized I had nowhere to go. My family lived hours away, and I wasn't ready to explain this mess to anyone. The thought of telling them, of saying the words out loud, was unbearable. It felt too real, too permanent. So I checked into a hotel. The irony wasn't lost on me. I stood in the lobby, my hands trembling as I handed over my ID and credit card. The clerk smiled politely, oblivious to the storm raging inside me. The room was small and nondescript, but it was quiet, and it was mine. I collapsed onto the bed, staring at the ceiling, trying to make sense of everything. Who was Laura Mitchell? How had she entered Greg's life? Was this some fleeting affair that spiraled out of control, or was she more than that? The questions gnawed at me, keeping me awake long into the night. I couldn't move on until I knew the truth. All of it. The next morning, I called the Aspen Ridge Hotel. My hands shook as I dialed the number, but I forced myself to stay calm. The receptionist answered cheerfully, and I launched into my carefully rehearsed explanation. I believe my husband stayed at your hotel recently, but there's been some confusion with the billing. Could you confirm the dates and the details of his reservation? The receptionist, a man this time, was more hesitant than the last. I'm sorry, ma'am, but I can't release that information without the guest's consent. I was ready for this. I understand, but I've already spoken to another hotel, and they were able to confirm similar details. This is really important. There's been a family emergency, and I need to know. There was a pause, then a sigh. One moment, please. As I waited, my pulse pounded in my ears. The receptionist returned a moment later. The reservation was for January 15th to January 18th. It was booked under Greg Thompson, and there was a second guest, Laura Mitchell. The confirmation hit me like a punch to the gut. This wasn't a one-time thing. This was a pattern. Was there any note or request attached to the reservation? I asked, my voice shaking. The receptionist hesitated again. There's a note about a dinner reservation for 2 at the hotel's restaurant and a spa appointment for Ms. Mitchell. I swallowed hard, my throat dry. Thank you, I whispered, and hung up. I sat there, staring at the phone, my mind racing. Greg and Laura hadn't just shared a room, they had shared moments, experiences. He had treated her to dinners and spa days, the kinds of things he used to do for me, back when we were happy. Back when I thought we were happy. I decided I needed to see her. I didn't know what I would say or do, but I couldn't sit in the dark any longer. I needed to confront the person who had taken a wrecking ball to my marriage. I searched her name online, and after some digging, I found her social media profiles. She was pretty, of course she was. Long dark hair, flawless skin, a radiant smile that mocked me from her photos. She didn't look like a homewrecker. She looked normal, ordinary even. But wasn't that always the way? One of her posts caught my attention. It was a picture of her standing in front of a yoga studio, smiling brightly. The caption read, "Grateful for this space and the peace it brings." The location tag was a studio just a few miles away. My hands shook as I stared at the screen. This was my chance. The next day, I went to the studio. I felt ridiculous, sitting in my car in the parking lot, watching the door like some kind of stalker. But I couldn't turn back. I needed to see her, to put a face to the name that had haunted me. It wasn't long before she appeared. She was even more beautiful in person, her yoga mat slung over her shoulder as she walked to her car. I got out of mine, my heart pounding. "Laura?" I called, my voice louder than I intended. She turned, startled. Her eyes widened as she saw me, confusion flickering across her face. "Yes," she said cautiously. I took a deep breath, willing myself to stay calm. "I'm Allison Thompson. Greg's wife." Her face drained of color. For a moment, she looked like she might run, but then she seemed to steady herself. I didn't know you'd find out," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. Her words hit me like a slap. "You didn't know I'd find out?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You've been sleeping with my husband, and that's all you have to say?" Tears welled in her eyes, but I didn't care. I was too angry, too hurt. "Do you love him?" I demanded. She hesitated, and that hesitation was all the answer I needed. "It wasn't supposed to happen like this," she said finally. "Greg told me things were over between you two. That you were just staying together for convenience." I laughed bitterly. Convenience? Is that what he called 18 years of marriage? A mortgage? A life? She didn't respond, her eyes brimming with tears. For a moment, I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "I hope he's worth it," I said, my voice cold. Because he's going to do to you what he did to me. I turned and walked away, leaving her standing there, her perfect little world crumbling just like mine had. But as I drove away, I didn't feel victorious. I felt empty. Broken. And I knew the hardest part was yet to come. The confrontation with Laura left me hollow. On the surface, I had told her off, exposed her lies to herself, but deep down, it didn't make me feel any better. The pain, the betrayal, it all lingered, heavy and suffocating. Driving back to the hotel where I had been staying, I felt a profound sense of detachment, as if my body was moving on autopilot while my mind reeled from the storm of emotions. When I got to my room, I collapsed on the bed, the confrontation playing on repeat in my head. Her face, the tears in her eyes, the way she had called my marriage a convenience. I hated her for what she had done, but I hated Greg even more. He was the one who had made the promises, the one who had vowed to love and honor me. He was the one who had betrayed me, not just with Laura, but with his lies, his cowardice, his double life. That night, I made a decision. I wasn't going to be a victim in this story. Greg had made his choices, and now it was time for me to make mine. I was done sitting around, waiting for him to come clean, to offer explanations that would only hurt me more. If he wanted Laura, if he wanted his new life, fine. But I wasn't going to let him walk away unscathed. He had destroyed my world, and now, I was going to make him face the consequences. The next morning, I called a divorce lawyer. Her name was Claire Matthews, and from the moment I heard her voice, I knew she was exactly who I needed. She was sharp, professional, and unflinchingly honest. Infidelity cases are tricky, she said, her tone brisk but not unkind. But given the evidence you've described, hotel receipts, a name, a confrontation with the other woman, we have a strong case. You're entitled to your fair share, and more. Hearing those words gave me a flicker of hope. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I had a shred of control over my life. Claire scheduled an appointment for me to come in the next day, and I spent the rest of the afternoon gathering every piece of evidence I could find. The receipts, the emails I had unearthed from Greg's account, even screenshots of Laura's social media posts. Every detail, every lie he had told, was now a weapon in my arsenal. That evening, Greg called me. I had ignored his texts and voicemails for days, but this time, I answered. I needed to hear his voice, to gauge his reaction to what was coming. "Allison," he said, his tone pleading. "Can we please talk? I miss you. I hate how things are between us." I laughed bitterly. "You miss me? Or are you just afraid of what's going to happen when the truth comes out?" He sighed heavily. "I know I messed up. I know I hurt you, and I'll never forgive myself for that. But I love you, Allison. I want to fix this." "Fix this?" I repeated, my voice rising. "You think you can fix this? You think some apology and a promise to do better will erase the fact that you've been living a double life? That you're going to have a child with another woman?" He was silent for a long moment. "I made a mistake," he said finally. "But I don't love her. I never did. It was a stupid, selfish thing, and it's over now." "Over?" I snapped. "How convenient for you. Tell me, Greg, is it still over when she calls to tell you she's in labor? When your child, Greg, is born? Is it over when you're splitting holidays and birthdays between two families?" He didn't respond. The weight of my words hung in the air, suffocating and undeniable. "I'll be filing for divorce," I said, my voice steady despite the tears streaming down my face. "You'll hear from my lawyer soon." "Allison, wait," he said, panic creeping into his voice. "We can work through this. Please, don't do this. Don't throw everything away." "You threw it away, Greg," I said softly. "You threw it away the moment you chose her over me." I hung up before he could say anything else. Over the next few weeks, I focused on rebuilding my life. It wasn't easy. The house we had shared felt like a mausoleum of broken dreams, so I put it on the market and found a small apartment closer to the city. It wasn't much, but it was mine. A fresh start. Claire was relentless in the divorce proceedings, ensuring I got not only a fair settlement but also a chunk of Greg's assets. He didn't fight me on much, probably out of guilt, but the process was still grueling. Each meeting, each document I signed, felt like ripping open a wound that refused to heal. Then there was the matter of Laura. I couldn't stop thinking about her, about the life she and Greg were building together. She hadn't reached out to me after our confrontation, and part of me was glad. I didn't want to hear her excuses, her justifications. But I couldn't help wondering, was she happy? Did she still think Greg was worth all the pain he had caused? One day, months after the divorce was finalized, I saw her again. I was at a coffee shop near my new apartment, flipping through a magazine, when she walked in. She was visibly pregnant now, her hand resting on her swollen belly. She looked radiant, glowing in a way that only deepened my resentment. I ducked my head, hoping she wouldn't see me, but it was too late. Her eyes met mine, and she hesitated before walking over. "Allison," she said softly. "Hi." I set my magazine down, my heart pounding. "Laura." She shifted uncomfortably, her hands still on her belly. I wanted to say I'm sorry. For everything." I stared at her, unsure how to respond. Her apology felt genuine, but it didn't erase the damage she had done. "I didn't know how much Greg was lying," she continued, her voice trembling. "I believed him when he said your marriage was over. I didn't realize," she trailed off, her eyes glistening with tears. For a moment, I felt a pang of sympathy. She was just as much a victim of Greg's lies as I was. But then I remembered the receipts, the dinners, the nights they had shared while I sat at home, oblivious. "I hope he makes you happy," I said finally, my voice cold. "I really do. Because he destroyed me to be with you." Her face crumpled, and she nodded. "I'm sorry," she whispered again before walking away. I watched her go, a strange mix of emotions swirling inside me. Anger. Sadness. Closure, maybe. She was his problem now. In the months and years that followed, I rebuilt my life piece by piece. I found a new job, made new friends, and even started dating again. The scars Greg left never fully healed, but they became a part of me, a reminder of my strength and resilience. As for Greg and Laura, I heard through mutual friends that their relationship didn't last. The weight of their betrayal, the complexities of their situation, it all came crashing down eventually. He tried to reach out to me once, but I didn't respond. That chapter of my life was closed. In the end, I realized that Greg's betrayal didn't define me. It hurt, yes, and it changed me in ways I couldn't have imagined. But it also taught me my own worth, my own strength. And for that, I was grateful. Life after Greg was both simpler and harder in ways I hadn't anticipated. Simpler because I no longer had to navigate his web of lies, his excuses, or the gnawing unease that had crept into our marriage long before I realized the extent of his betrayal. Harder because starting over, truly starting over, is a daunting task, especially when your heart is still tender, bruised by the weight of shattered trust. I stayed busy. Too busy, if I'm honest. Work became my sanctuary. I took on extra projects, volunteered for late shifts, and even joined a committee I had previously avoided. My boss, Angela, noticed and pulled me aside one day. "You're doing incredible work, Allison," she said, her tone gentle. "But you don't have to carry the whole company on your shoulders. Is everything okay?" I forced a smile, brushing off her concern. "I'm fine. Just keeping busy." But busy wasn't enough to fill the quiet moments. At night, in the small apartment I had rented after selling the house, the silence was deafening. I missed the sound of Greg's voice, even though it was laced with lies. I missed the comfort of familiarity, even though that familiarity had been a facade. And more than anything, I missed the version of myself who had believed in love, who had trusted without hesitation. Months turned into a year. By the time the first anniversary of my divorce rolled around, I felt like a different person. Stronger, perhaps. Wiser, definitely. But there was still a part of me that was healing, that flinched at the thought of opening my heart again. So when my best friend, Rachel, insisted on setting me up with someone, I was hesitant. "You've been through hell, Allison," she said one evening over drinks. "But you can't let Greg ruin the rest of your life. You deserve to be happy." "I don't think I'm ready," I admitted, swirling my wine glass. "What if I get hurt again?" Rachel reached across the table, squeezing my hand. "Then you get back up. You've already proven how strong you are. And besides," she added with a sly smile, "not all men are Greg." Reluctantly, I agreed to the blind date. His name was James, and he was nothing like Greg. Where Greg had been polished and charming, James was down to earth and a little awkward in the most endearing way. He showed up to the coffee shop with a slightly crooked tie and a bouquet of wildflowers, apologizing profusely for being 3 minutes late. "I wasn't sure what kind of flowers you liked," he said, handing them to me. "So I just picked these because they seemed happy." I couldn't help but laugh. It was the first genuine laugh I'd had in a long time. Our conversation flowed easily. James was a teacher, passionate about his students and full of funny stories about his time coaching the school's soccer team. He listened intently when I talked about my work, asking thoughtful questions and genuinely seeming interested. For the first time in what felt like forever, I felt seen, not as a wife or an ex-wife, but as a person. By the end of the date, I realized I hadn't thought about Greg once. It felt like a small victory. James and I began seeing each other regularly. He was patient and kind, never pushing me to move faster than I was ready for. When I finally told him about Greg, about the betrayal, the lies, and the divorce, he didn't flinch. He just listened, holding my hand as I poured out everything I had kept bottled up for so long. "You didn't deserve that," he said softly when I finished. "None of it. But you're here now, and that says a lot about the kind of person you are." His words stayed with me. Slowly, I began to let my guard down, to believe that maybe, just maybe, I could have a future that wasn't defined by my past. One evening, nearly 2 years after the divorce, I received an unexpected email from Greg. The subject line simply read, "I'm sorry." My hands trembled as I opened it, unsure of what I would find. His message was long, rambling, and full of apologies. He admitted to everything, the lies, the infidelity, the way he had failed me as a husband. He talked about Laura, how their relationship had fallen apart under the weight of their choices, and how he was trying to be a good father to their son. "I don't expect your forgiveness," he wrote. "But I wanted you to know how deeply sorry I am for everything I put you through. You deserved better, and I will regret hurting you for the rest of my life." I stared at the screen for a long time, unsure how to feel. His words didn't absolve him, nor did they erase the pain he had caused. But for the first time, they felt genuine. Not an excuse, not a justification, just an acknowledgement of the harm he had done. I didn't respond. I didn't need to. His apology wasn't for me, it was for him. And while it didn't change the past, it gave me a strange sense of closure. I didn't need his regret to move on, I had already done that. But it felt like the final page in a chapter 1 was ready to close for good. James proposed to me a year later, in the middle of a quiet picnic at our favorite park. His hands shook as he held out the ring, his voice cracking as he told me how much he loved me, how much he wanted to build a life with me. Tears streamed down my face as I said yes, my heart full of a joy I hadn't thought possible. Our wedding was small and intimate, attended by only our closest friends and family. As I stood there, looking into James's eyes, I felt a profound sense of peace. This was love, not perfect, not without its challenges, but real and honest. Years later, as I watched our children playing in the backyard, their laughter filling the air, I thought about the journey that had brought me here. The pain, the betrayal, the heartbreak, it had all led me to this moment, to this life I had built with James. I wouldn't have chosen that path, but I was grateful for where it had brought me. Greg was a distant memory, a cautionary tale I rarely revisited. I knew he had remarried eventually, and from what I heard through mutual friends, he seemed happy. I wished him no ill will, but I didn't dwell on him either. My focus was on the present, on the love and happiness I had found after so much darkness. Because in the end, Greg hadn't destroyed me. He had tried, yes, but I had rebuilt myself stronger than before. And that, I realized, was the greatest victory of all. The years rolled on, steady and kind, as I settled into the life I had rebuilt. My children with James, our children, became the center of my world, filling it with laughter, chaos, and the kind of love that feels almost too big for words. We had two, a spirited little girl named Emma and a thoughtful boy named Caleb. They were everything to me, living reminders of the life I had fought so hard to reclaim. James was a steady, unwavering partner. He wasn't perfect, of course, no one is, but he was honest, dependable, and patient in ways that felt revolutionary after Greg. He knew my wounds, even the invisible ones, and never treated them like something I needed to get over. Instead, he treated them as part of me, just as much as the parts that smiled and laughed and loved him fiercely in return. But even in the happiness I had found, the past would sometimes whisper to me. Greg's betrayal was a scar, and scars have a way of aching when the weather changes. One such whisper came when Emma turned 7. She had been begging for a pet for months, and James and I finally caved, taking her to a shelter to pick out a cat. She chose a fluffy gray tabby she named Cloud, and the joy on her face as she carried him home was infectious. That evening, as I watched her cuddle Cloud on the couch, a pang of memory hit me out of nowhere. Greg had always wanted a cat. I remembered how he used to joke about bringing one home, how I had brushed off the idea because I wasn't a cat person. It was such a small, inconsequential memory, but it clawed at me in a way I couldn't shake. Later that night, after the kids were asleep, I found myself scrolling through my email, searching for Greg's old apology. I hadn't looked at it in years. When I found it, I read it again, my heart quieter this time. His words didn't sting the way they once had, instead, they felt distant. Like reading the diary of a stranger. James noticed me sitting in bed, the glow of the laptop on my face. "What's on your mind?" he asked, sliding into bed beside me. I hesitated before closing the laptop. "Just thinking about the past." He nodded, wrapping an arm around me. "It's okay to think about it. It's part of who you are." I rested my head against his shoulder, grateful for his understanding. "Do you ever think about your exes?" I asked, curious. He chuckled. "Sometimes, I guess. But mostly to be grateful they're not still in my life." I smiled, feeling the weight of the memory lift. He was right. Greg was a part of my story, but he wasn't my whole story. The life I had now, the love I had now, was what mattered. Greg's name didn't come up again until years later, when Caleb turned 13. It was the kind of milestone that makes you reflect on time, on where you were when your own life shifted from one stage to another. 13 was the age I met Greg, back when we were just kids with no idea of the lives we would lead or the pain we would cause each other. Caleb, so much like me in his quiet thoughtfulness, had started asking more questions about family history. He was working on a school project about ancestry and wanted to trace both James's side and mine. The project required digging through old family photos, and as we sorted through albums, Greg's face appeared in a few. "Who's that?" Caleb asked, pointing to a photo of Greg and me at a New Year's Eve party years before Caleb was born. I hadn't thought about that photo in ages. It was from a happier time, back when Greg's love felt real and uncomplicated. "That's someone I used to know," I said carefully. Caleb gave me a curious look, clearly sensing there was more to the story. "Was he your friend?" "Sort of," I replied, unsure how much to say. "He was my first husband." Caleb's eyes widened. "You were married before Dad?" I nodded, feeling a strange mix of emotions. Yes, but it was a long time ago. Things didn't work out, and we both moved on. Does Dad know about him? Caleb asked, still curious but not judgmental. Of course he does, I said with a soft laugh. There's nothing to hide. Caleb seemed satisfied with that answer and returned to his project, but the moment stayed with me. It was a reminder that my past wasn't buried, it was simply a foundation I had built something better on. And while it didn't define me, it would always be part of the story I carried. The final chapter of Greg's presence in my life came unexpectedly. One afternoon, years later, I received a call from a number I didn't recognize. Normally, I would have let it go to voicemail, but something compelled me to answer. Allison, a woman's voice asked tentatively. Yes, this is she. This is Laura, the voice said, and my breath caught. It had been over a decade since I last saw her. Laura, I repeated, my voice guarded. What do you want? I'm sorry to bother you, she said quickly. I wasn't sure if I should call, but it's about Greg. I felt a jolt of unease. What about him? There was a pause before she spoke again, her voice heavy. He passed away. A heart attack. It was sudden. The words hung in the air, surreal and weightless. Greg, gone? It didn't feel real. I thought you should know, Laura continued. He talked about you sometimes. I think he always felt guilty for what happened. I didn't know what to say. A strange mix of emotions swirled inside me, sadness, shock, even anger. But mostly, I felt a sense of finality. Thank you for letting me know, I said finally, my voice steady. After I hung up, I sat in silence for a long time. Greg's death was a reminder of how fleeting life is, how fragile the bonds we create can be. But it was also a reminder of how far I had come. He was a part of my story, but only a part. The rest of the story, the best of it, was mine to write. And so I did. Every day, I wrote it with love, with laughter, and with a deep appreciation for the life I had built. A life forged in resilience and filled with joy. A life that, despite everything, was mine. The news of Greg's death lingered in my mind for days. It wasn't that I felt grief, exactly, our love had died long before he had. But there was something unsettling about knowing he was gone, about the finality of it. His presence in the world had been like a shadow on the edges of my life, faint but always there. Now, even the shadow was gone. I didn't tell James immediately. It wasn't out of secrecy but because I needed time to process it on my own. When I finally brought it up over dinner one evening, James listened quietly, his brow furrowed with concern. How do you feel about it? He asked when I finished. I'm not sure, I admitted. It's strange. I don't feel sad, exactly. But I don't feel nothing, either. He was such a big part of my life for so long, even if it ended badly. It's hard to reconcile that he's just gone. James nodded thoughtfully. That makes sense. He wasn't a good partner to you, but he was still part of your story. It's okay to feel complicated about it. His understanding brought me a sense of comfort I hadn't expected. James had a way of giving me space to feel whatever I needed to feel without judgment or expectation. It was one of the many reasons I loved him so deeply. A few weeks later, I received an envelope in the mail. It was addressed to me in a handwriting I didn't recognize, and when I opened it, I found a letter from Laura. Allison. I know we haven't spoken in years, and I wasn't sure if I should reach out. But after Greg's passing, I've been going through his things, and I found something I think belongs to you. It's a journal. I didn't read much of it, it didn't feel right, but from what I saw, it seems like he wrote a lot about you. About your marriage, and what he did to you. I thought you should have it. If you want it, let me know, and I'll send it to you. I hope you're doing well. I truly am sorry for everything. Laura. I stared at the letter for a long time, my emotions a whirlwind. A journal? Greg had never been the type to write things down, or at least, I hadn't thought he was. The idea of reading his private thoughts, of uncovering pieces of him I hadn't known, was both intriguing and terrifying. I debated whether to respond. Part of me wanted to leave it alone, to let the past stay buried. But another part of me, the part that still wondered why he had done the things he did, couldn't resist the chance to find out. In the end, curiosity won. I sent Laura a brief note thanking her and telling her she could send the journal. It arrived a week later, wrapped carefully in brown paper. My hands trembled as I unwrapped it, revealing a simple black notebook. I sat down at the kitchen table, hesitating before I opened it. Did I really want to do this? Did I want to dredge up feelings I had worked so hard to move past? But I couldn't stop myself. Taking a deep breath, I opened the journal and began to read. The entries were scattered and inconsistent, dated sporadically over the course of several years. Some were from the early days of our marriage, full of excitement and hope. Others were from the later years, when the cracks had started to show. His words were raw and unpolished, revealing a side of him I had rarely seen. Allison deserves better than me. I know that. She's so good, so kind, and I'm not. I keep thinking I'll change, that I'll be the man she thinks I am. But I don't know how. I don't know if I can. My chest tightened as I read those words. He had known, even then, that he was failing me. And yet, he had kept making the same choices, kept hurting me in ways I hadn't understood until it was too late. Further in, I found entries from the time he had started seeing Laura. They were harder to read, filled with guilt and self-justification in equal measure. I didn't mean for this to happen. I never wanted to hurt Allison, but with Laura, it's different. She doesn't expect so much from me. She doesn't see all the ways I fall short. The excuses felt hollow, even on the page. But there was a vulnerability to his words, a desperate need to explain himself, even if only to a blank sheet of paper, that I hadn't expected. He wasn't trying to justify his actions to me, he was trying to justify them to himself. The final entries were the hardest to read. They were written after our divorce, and they were filled with regret. I destroyed the best thing I ever had. Allison didn't deserve what I did to her. She was everything I could have wanted, and I threw it away. I don't know if I'll ever forgive myself. I closed the journal, tears streaming down my face. The words didn't absolve him, and they didn't change what had happened. But they gave me a sense of understanding I hadn't had before. Greg had been broken in ways I couldn't fix, and his choices had been a reflection of that brokenness, not of my worth or my failures. That night, I told James about the journal. He listened quietly as I recounted what I had read, his hand resting on mine. "Do you feel better?" he asked when I finished. "Not better, exactly," I said. "But maybe, lighter. Like I can finally let go of the questions I've been carrying all these years." He nodded. "Then it was worth it." I put the journal away in a box in the closet, along with the other remnants of my life with Greg. I didn't need to keep it out, it wasn't something I planned to revisit often. But it felt right to keep it, a reminder of where I had been and how far I had come. As the years went by, the pain of Greg's betrayal faded into the background, replaced by the love and joy I had built with James and our children. The life I had now was everything I could have hoped for, and more. And while Greg's shadow still lingered in small, quiet ways, it no longer had the power to hurt me. Because I had learned the most important lesson of all, I was stronger than the pain. Stronger than the betrayal. And stronger than the man who had once tried to break me.